a story you'll definitely want to hear to the end. The Long-Awaited Truth, Part 1, Ghosts of the Past. In a small, cozy apartment where sunbeams get tangled in the tulle curtains and settle as golden dust on children's toys, live Emily and David. 15 years. For some, it's just a moment, but for them, it's an entire era, woven from patches of dazzling happiness, bitter disappointments, loud laughter, and quiet tears. Their life together resembled a cardiogram, sharp peaks when it seemed their love could move mountains, and frightening dips into the abyss of alienation. The last few years had been a prolonged nosedive. Fights erupted over the smallest things: an uncapped tube of toothpaste, a shirt thrown on a chair, a careless word. Each clash left new scratches on their souls, and without trying to heal them, they simply drifted further apart. The word divorce, once unthinkable and terrifying, now hung more and more often in the oppressive silence, becoming almost commonplace. After another storm, which left behind only the ashes of hurtful words, David, devastated and exhausted, silently put on his jacket and left the house. His feet led him to a forest lake, their sacred place, where many years ago, still young and carefree, they had spent their first romantic weekends. The air here was different, thick, infused with the scent of pine needles and damp earth. He sat down on their old bench that had settled into the ground at the very edge of the water, and it hit him. Not like a wave, but a true tsunami of memories. There was Emily, just a girl, laughing as she ran through the shallows, the splashes flying like diamonds in the setting sun. And there they were, wrapped in a single blanket, gazing at the stars as David whispered in his ear that their love would be as eternal as the Milky Way. Where had it all gone? At what point had they lost the guiding thread that had so tightly bound their hearts? He remembered her laugh, the warmth of her hands, the way she could listen, looking right into his soul. A sharp, almost physical pain shot through him. He realized that despite all the fatigue and irritation, he wasn't ready to let her go. He could. At that very same moment, Emily, left alone in the ringing emptiness of the apartment, wandered aimlessly from room to room. Her gaze fell on the top shelf of the bookcase, where an old photo album was gathering dust. Their honeymoon. With trembling hands, she took it down and began to flip through the glossy pages. There they were, ridiculously young and deliriously happy, against the backdrop of an azure sea. Her finger paused on a photo where David was kissing her tenderly, his eyes filled with such boundless affection that it took Emily's breath away. A bitter lump formed in her throat. She remembered how light and winged she had felt by his side, how they had spent nights planning their future, dreaming of a big house, a garden, and the sound of children's laughter. They hadn't just lost passion, they had lost themselves in this endless war. "I have to fix this," she whispered. They needed to talk, to try to hear each other and glue back together what seemed to have shattered into a million pieces. But deep in her soul, under 7 locks, she kept a secret, a heavy, cold stone she had carried within her all these years. Infidelity. A word she was afraid to even think. A word David never knew. And now, looking into the happy eyes of the girl in the photo, she understood with terrifying clarity that she could no longer live with this lie. Part 2. The Revelation. A few days passed. A fragile, barely perceptible truth, established after David's return, offered a faint glimmer of hope. To solidify it, to escape the confines of their familiar walls, they decided to spend the weekend at that same forest lake. Evening enveloped the shore on a cool blue twilight. The flames of the campfire they had built together cast whimsical, dancing shadows on their faces. The conversation, which began with trivial household matters, gradually deepened. They spoke of their fears, their disappointments, of how they had imperceptibly transformed from two halves of a whole into two lonely people under one roof. Emily felt her heart pounding somewhere in her throat. She knew the time had come. It was now or never. David, her voice was quiet and broken, barely audible over the crackling logs. I have to tell you something. It was a long time ago. Do you remember that year when we were on the verge of breaking up? When you had already packed your bags? I was so crushed, so alone. It felt like the world had collapsed and I was left alone under the rubble. And then another man came into my life. David froze. His gaze, which had been wandering over the embers, locked onto her face. He was silent, and this silence was more terrifying than any scream. He let her finish, though everything inside him had clenched into an icy knot.
He was just there, Emily continued with difficulty, swallowing back tears. He said the right things. He was kind. It wasn't love, David, I swear. It was like trying to quench an unbearable thirst with salt water, which only makes it worse. A fleeting, empty affair. It meant nothing, but it left this horrible, unhealing scar on my soul. I was weak. I made a mistake. And I've lived with this all these years, hating myself every day for the lie that stood between us like an invisible wall. Forgive me, if you can. Silence fell, deafening, thick, in which only the crackling of the fire and their own breathing could be heard. David slowly raised his eyes to hers. They held a storm, disbelief, anger, an all-consuming pain, and utter confusion. His world, which had only begun to find a fragile balance, shattered into dust in an instant. His first instinct was to jump up, to leave, to run away from this cutting truth, away from her. But something held him back. Perhaps it was the same ghosts of the past he had encountered here a few days before. He looked at her face contorted with suffering, at the tears silently streaming down her cheeks, and instead of unleashing his anger, he asked a single question, croaking it through the lump in his throat. Why? And that question marked the beginning of the most terrifying and most important conversation of their lives. Choking on sobs, Emily spoke of her desperation, of her fear of losing him forever, of how that act had become a perpetual reminder of her own weakness. She didn't try to justify herself. She simply laid her broken soul bare before him. And David listened. He listened not only to the words, but to the unspoken pain behind them. And gradually, through the haze of hurt, understanding began to dawn. The emptiness she had so desperately tried to fill, they had created together. He, too, was guilty of the coldness, of the loneliness they shared. He realized their relationship needed not just reconciliation, but a complete reconstruction, from the very foundation up. Part 3. The Path to Forgiveness. They spent the night after the revelation almost without sleep. They didn't speak, lying next to each other, but
thousands of miles apart. Each was processing what had happened, lost in their own thoughts. But in the morning, they didn't leave. They stayed. This silent choice was more important than any words. The next few days at the lake turned into a strange, painful, but necessary cleansing. They walked in silence along familiar paths, remembering their past. Not only the hurt surfaced, but also the bright moments. The first clumsy kiss under that old pine tree, their jointed, laughter-filled attempts to light a fire, the night spent by the campfire dreaming of a future that seemed so cloudless. These memories, like a healing balm, soothed the fresh bleeding wounds.
Their 6-year-old son, Leo, brought a sense of lightness and innocence to the tense atmosphere. He didn't understand the full drama, but sensed that something was different between his parents. His childish questions, devoid of any subtext, sometimes hit the mark perfectly. "Dad, why was Mom crying by the fire last night? Did she get smoke in her eyes?" he asked in the morning, and David, swallowing a lump in his throat, replied, "Yes, buddy, the smoke was really strong." One day, while digging through a bag, Leo stumbled upon the same wedding photos Emily had brought with him. He ran to them, waving a picture where they looked so happy. "Mom, Dad, look, you guys look so silly here, and you're smiling. Why don't you smile like that now?" This simple question hit them both like a punch to the gut. They exchanged a look, and in each other's eyes, they saw the unspoken answer. "You're right. Why don't we?" They realized they owed it not only to themselves, but to this little person who looked at them with such boundless love, to try to bring real, not just polite happiness back into their home. One evening, as they sat again by the dying embers of the fire, David spoke about his feelings for the first time without anger or blame. "You know, I always thought infidelity was the end, a betrayal that erases everything. But now, I'm trying to understand. I remember that year. I was unbearable too. I buried myself in my problems, in my work. I stopped noticing you. I built that wall between us myself. I'm not excusing what you did, but I understand that I was also to blame." These words were a lifeline for Emily in her ocean of guilt and self-loathing. He didn't just forgive her, he shared the responsibility. They both understood they couldn't do this alone. Their wounds were too deep, and their resentments had taken root too long ago. They needed help from the outside. The decision to see a marriage counselor was not an easy one. It was an admission of their own powerlessness. But it was their first conscious joint step into a new, unknown life. A step taken not out of desperation, but out of a desire to fight for their family. They were just beginning the long and arduous path to forgiveness, but they had taken the first, most important step on it. Returning to the city apartment, whose walls were silent witnesses to their years of battles, was a real test. Any little thing could become a trigger, pulling them back into the familiar rut of mutual reproaches. But something had subtly changed. The conversation by the lake had become a point of no return. Living the old way was no longer possible. They began seeing a marriage counselor. Each session was like complex surgery on the soul without anesthesia. They lanced old wounds, brought long-buried splinters of resentment to light. It was excruciating. Sometimes they would return home so emotionally drained that the chasm between them seemed even wider. But then, one of them would find the strength to be the first to approach, to offer a silent hug or simply make a cup of tea, and that was more important than any words. They were learning to talk to each other again, learning to say, "I feel lonely," instead of, "You never pay attention to me." Learning to listen not to rebut, but to understand. These started a tradition of honesty evenings, where once a week they would sit across from each other and talk about everything that had accumulated in their souls without fear of judgment. Gradually, the icy wall of alienation began to melt. David saw in Emily not a treacherous betrayer, but a frightened, desperate woman who made a mistake and had suffered terribly from it for years. And Emily, in turn, was rediscovering David, not just as a husband and father, but as a man capable of incredible depth of understanding and the most difficult thing of all, forgiveness. Their son Leo, without knowing it, was the main catalyst for these changes. One day, drawing their family, he depicted their mom and dad holding hands tightly with a huge smiling sun drawn above their heads. "There," he announced proudly, "now you're smiling again, just like in that picture." Emily and David looked at each other and smiles indeed played on their lips. Sincere, warm, a little tired, but absolutely real. They understood that love is not just a firework of passion and romance. Love is also daily, sometimes grueling work. It's the willingness to accept imperfection in oneself and in one's partner. It's a choice you have to make every morning when you wake up next to each other. A year later, they returned to that same lake. Now it was not a place of pain, but a symbol of their rebirth. They stood on the shore holding hands and watched as the setting sun painted the water's surface in gold and crimson. "Thank you," Emily said softly, "for not leaving back then." "And I'm grateful to you for the truth," David replied just as quietly, hugging her. However bitter it was, it didn't kill us. It made us more honest, and I think much stronger. They stood in silence, watching the last ray of sunlight disappear below the horizon. Ahead of them was a new day, a new dawn for their relationship. They knew there would still be storms and cloudy days on their path, but now they had something they didn't have before: absolute honesty and the certainty that together they could get through anything. Because their love, tempered by pain and washed by forgiveness, had found a new, incredible depth. They understood that sometimes, to build something truly strong, you first have to let the old structure crumble to its very foundation. And on those ruins, stone by stone, hand in hand, you can build a new home whose foundation is not a fragile illusion, but the long-awaited, hard-won truth. Stories are born from emotions. If this story stirred any feelings in you, please share your thoughts. Every comment is a spark of inspiration for new stories about struggle, strength, and the hope that never fades, even in the harshest reality.